In July 1931, in the midst of the Great Depression, the London-based Gramophone magazine published a letter from a reader based in Wanganui, New Zealand, WJR, who noted that gramophonists out here flourish under conditions more adverse than those prevailing in Britain. Very few, if any, of the shops here, even in the large centres, keep complete stocks of any make of records, and some of the records released at home, that is Britain, are never issued here at all. Prices are also much higher here. To us in New Zealand, the gramophone means much, for it's practically our only means of hearing many world-famous artists whose visits here are few and very far between. Of course, most of the touring celebrities visit only the four main centres, so that's Dunedin, Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland, leaving the smaller towns severely alone. However, we hope patiently for the day when wireless will have become so improved as to bridge the 12,000 miles separating us, enabling us to enjoy Covent Garden as well as though we were present at a performance. And little did he know what was to happen. WJR was one of a number of New Zealanders who wrote letters to the editor of Gramophone magazine, Compton Mackenzie, in the 1920s and 1930s, from locations spread across the country, from Invercargill in the deep south to Auckland in the north. The most common themes were the high cost of records and the occasional difficulty in obtaining specific recordings. While in 1926, Mary Stuckey of Dunedin also complained about the, quote, tantalising fashion in which the gramophone competitions have of closing within a day or two of the arrival of the magazine in New Zealand. Another key refrain from New Zealand-based contributors was the importance of gramophone records in a country that had no great orchestras, hardly a string quartet, and only one choir of outstanding merit. And furthermore, where concert performances of chamber music featuring wind instruments are virtually unknown, and lovers of this beautiful and intimate form of music can make its acquaintance only by means of recordings. This was a point reiterated in the magazine in 1932 by Donald Reed, who wrote, "People in Europe little realise how starved people are musically in the out-of-the-way parts of the empire. Even in the big towns, things are not much better. One finds in the colonies many enthusiastic musicians, both professional and amateur, who have made large collections of records." One such enthusiast was Philip Marchant, who made numerous contributions to the gramophone, including reviews of Italian opera recordings. In his 1926 article, Some Notes on Puccini's La Bohème, Marchant asked readers to forgive any possible omissions, since some recordings were simply unprocurable in this part of the world. There are no towns nearer the South Pole than Invercargill, New Zealand. Yet despite the existence of a healthy community of gramophone enthusiasts and the increasing frequency with which local businesses published aspirational images, such as this one from a Wellington newspaper in 1928, not every New Zealander who was interested in music had access to a library of records, let alone the means to buy a gramophone or the private space in which to house and enjoy such consumer goods. Nevertheless, evidence from contemporary newspapers and magazines, together with a handful of surviving gramophone recital programs and photographs, demonstrate that significant numbers of New Zealanders, both Māori and Pākehā, enjoyed listening to gramophone records outside of their domestic environments, particularly during the 1920s and 1930s. In my paper today, I'll investigate the varied settings in which recordings were shared communally during the first 4 decades of the 20th century, and in the process, explore the meaning of the gramophone to New Zealanders during that time period. The earliest demonstration of a phonograph in Aotearoa, New Zealand, took place in Littleton, near Christchurch, in 1879, just 2 years after its invention in the United States by Thomas Edison, to an audience of around 12,000 people. The new technology was quick to be adopted, and by 1901, a chain of stores had been established throughout the country, called the Talkeries, where customers could buy gramophones, records, and accessories. By the second decade of the 20th century, newspaper reports of society gatherings, such as garden or evening parties, at homes, and afternoon teas, frequently referred to the playing of records, generally including commentary on the high quality of both the gramophone used and the music chosen. And I've just given you 4 examples from many here, together with a picture of the Prime Minister and his family, Joseph Ward, who apparently owned a, quote, especially good gramophone. Yet gramophone records were also being enjoyed communally by a much wider selection of the New Zealand public, with listeners drawn from a range of ages, wealth, and ethnicities. As the century progressed, gramophones began to be heard on a regular basis on the street, played by buskers, as well as in numerous public institutions, such as schools, old people's homes, and hospitals. Much of the evidence for this can be found in reports published in newspapers and magazines, which reveal that gramophones were being used in remote rural settings as well as in large urban ones. And I've just given you 3 examples here. Even more remote than the Southland farming community of Dipton, a picture of which is shown on the slide, was Tolaga Bay on the isolated east coast of New Zealand's North Island. In 1713, an emergency hospital was set up there in a whare runanga, or large Maori meeting house, for 3 local Maori fever patients. According to an account in the country's Nurses' Journal, great was the delight when they got permission to have a gramophone concert. The best gramophone was brought along, and all those who possessed records sent them. Needless to say, the program was varied. One had to be stretched over 2 or 3 days. During World War I, a group of influential women in Wellington formed a so-called gramophone club, whose purpose was to raise funds for supplying soldiers with gramophones and records. By the end of the conflict, they had provided permanent gramophones and records of the best kind to troops based in local training camps and military hospitals, as well as some stationed overseas, including at the Market Hall Barracks in Apia, Samoa. Putting aside such institutional settings for now, throughout the early decades of the 20th century, there were 3 key types of gatherings at which members of the general New Zealand public regularly heard gramophone records: fundraisers, trade recitals, and gramophone circles or clubs. The use of gramophone recordings as part of fundraising events was hugely popular throughout this period, whether as the sole performer on the program or, as was more usual, with selections on a gramophone forming part of a concert that also included live music, recitations, dancing, or other types of items. It's clear that in the first decade of the century, the inclusion of gramophone recordings offered a highly attractive novelty factor for such fundraising events, particularly in small remote settlements. And the machine was generally lent by a generous member of the local community, or in some larger locations, by a local business that acted as an agent for gramophones and records. In the small town of Littleton in 1902, for example, Hubert Gentles gave an open-air entertainment from the balcony of Warner's Hotel with his loud-sounding gramophone in aid of the Veterans Home Fund. Several members of the Christchurch Fire Brigade took up a collection. Gramophones were heard, normally interspersed with live performances, at countless church and school fetes and concerts raising money for church organs, free libraries, hospitals, children's aid societies, and many more besides. Having sifted through hundreds of newspaper reports of such events, it becomes obvious that listening to gramophone recordings was particularly appealing in isolated communities, where such items were presumably often few and far between. Over the summer of 1910 to 11, for example, a group of Wellington gentlemen camping in Jacobs Bay, near the Pelorus Sounds town of Havelock, gave a series of gramophone recitals in the Havelock Town Hall, using a machine lent by the Wellington branch of music shop Beggs, whose manager, Salvatore Cimino, was one of the campers. These events featured recordings by bands, choirs, and Nellie Melba, Enrico Caruso, Peter Dawson, among others, and they raised money for the Havelock Cottage Hospital. Increasingly, during the 1920s, specialised gramophone recitals that generally comprised solely the playing of records became popular as fundraising events. A particularly successful series were the gramophone recitals given by the Wellington Red Cross, which raised significant sums for the junior division of their branch. These ran from December 1924 and numbered more than 20 recitals in total, all held in the Red Cross chambers. As outlined in newspaper items promoting these concerts, brief explanations of operatic and other records will be given prior to their being played. The object of the recitals is to give lovers of gramophone music an evening of music from carefully selected records, and to provide them with the opportunity for musical discussion and exchange of views. During the coming year, programs will be arranged to suit all patrons. The recitals are being given by enthusiasts who are not monetarily interested in the sale of gramophone requisites. The charge for admission was 1 shilling, with printed programs provided free. The programs were dominated by classical repertoire, being aimed at enthusiastic and well-informed lovers of good music, and were widely advertised and reviewed in local newspapers. Highly popular with audiences, each recital was organised and presented by a different individual, both men and women, who drew upon records from their own collections, as well as from some lent by local music shops. Among those who supplied their gramophone and records for a recital in the Red Cross series was Lindsay Buick, a Member of Parliament for Wairau. Buick was also the author of a short book called The Romance of the Gramophone, which was published in Wellington in 1927 and reviewed in the Gramophone magazine the following year, where it was described as an eminently readable, enjoyable book. It's possible that this photograph of the audience at a gramophone recital in Wellington that's reproduced in Buick's book depicts one from the Red Cross series. Such events, fundraising recitals, were perhaps influenced by the success of trade recitals. Representatives of European and American gramophone manufacturers had visited New Zealand from the early 1900s onwards, giving free recitals to promote their wares, above all in the main centres. Then, by the second decade of the 20th century, local music shops that sold gramophones and records increasingly arranged trade recitals, to which admission was free, as a means of drumming up business in both cities and smaller towns across the country. Some of these events proved so popular that audience members were turned away, and large venues had to be hired for future recitals, while other businesses, including Beggs in Wellington, even built special gramophone recital rooms to accommodate their guests. Some music stores were particularly enterprising, sending representatives to give gramophone recitals in far-flung locations, as well as in diverse suburbs of major cities. Such trade recitals, which presented the very latest records, as well as the latest advances in gramophone technology, in an effort to get customers to buy them, obviously, reached their peak in the late 1920s. The pinnacle in New Zealand was almost certainly the free gramophone recital held in the Auckland Town Hall by Howie's Limited in 1929, and more than 3,000 people reportedly attended this recital, and here's a photograph taken at that event. It was around the same time, during the mid to late 1920s, that gramophone clubs and circles reached a height of popularity in New Zealand, above all in large centres. These generally consisted of a set and reasonably small number of members who often met in private homes, local halls, or tea rooms, and sometimes shared their own collections amongst members. Although models differed, they tended to meet fortnightly, and one person was in charge of selecting and presenting recordings, which were then discussed over supper afterwards. Some were supported by local businesses, as was the Dunedin-based Otago Gramophone and Social Club, which formed in 1928 and met regularly at the Waratah Hall. They were lent gramophones and records by various local firms that kept changing all the time. A subscription of 5 shillings was paid per member per season, and the committee members included both male and females. By the late 1920s, however, major societal changes were underfoot. Although the effects of the Wall Street crash of October 1929 were not immediate in New Zealand, by the early 1930s, export prices had begun to dive steeply, which was ruinous to a country that was largely dependent on its farming exports. The subsequent economic pressures soon began to affect individuals across New Zealand society, leading to large-scale business closures and major job losses across the board. Newspaper records show a clear decline in gramophone concerts during the Great Depression, both in the form of trade recitals and gramophone clubs. A further factor in their demise was, of course, radio, which, having started being broadcast across New Zealand in 1925 by a private company, was taken over by the government in 1932. By the mid-1930s, radio had largely overtaken the gramophone in terms of popularity. A further factor was the establishment of the Australasian Performing Rights Association in 1926 to manage the performance and communication rights of its members. The gramophone was to see a resurgence in popularity in New Zealand only in the latter 1930s, a move linked to both an apparent craze for modern dances and an increasing desire for choice, as opposed to the predetermined selections available on radio. Furthermore, a growing adult education movement, epitomised through the Workers' Educational Association, increasingly emphasised cultural studies, including musical appreciation of so-called high-class music, i.e. classical music. This led to the establishment of numerous new gramophone circles across the country, including in Wellington in 1936, Dunedin 1938, and in Nelson in 1944, as well as elsewhere. So, what did the gramophone mean to New Zealanders? Unfortunately, there's very little available information regarding how people experienced the gramophone recitals I've talked about, or how they responded on a personal level when listening to the gramophone performances more generally. It's clear, though, that these events were highly popular given the large numbers reported attending, particularly in the late 1920s. As the New Zealand-based gramophone enthusiasts writing to the Gramophone magazine at the start of my paper indicated, despite their extreme distance from Europe and America, interested New Zealanders who were not in a position to travel to those faraway locations were well able to keep themselves informed about the latest development in major musical centres through gramophone recordings. This was critical in a country where concert life was hindered by the small population and complete lack of permanent full-size orchestras or opera companies. This is despite what Melinda Cooper observes as a long-standing perception of Anglophone settler colonies as having been backwards and belated in relation to the more sophisticated and au courant metropolitan centre, London. Indeed, as noted in a recent issue of the journal Modernist Cultures that was focused on Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia and Fiji, there still exists among scholars of modernism a lingering prejudice that assumes distance from London, Paris and New York must signify backwardness, and which, in David Carter's words, translates geographical distance into cultural belatedness, as if ideas were required to swim slowly across the ocean before arriving on Pacific shores. Gramophone recordings surely reduced New Zealanders' sense of extreme isolation to some degree, and allowed them to feel connected internationally as members of a rapidly expanding international consumer economy, through shared experiences of listening to and collecting recordings. They must have also kept some Pākehā New Zealanders in touch with their own cultural heritage and helped to build their own community identity, both locally and globally, by allowing them to come together with others in person or on the printed page to appreciate and at times to debate compositions and performances that they would otherwise not have had the chance to hear. Thank you.